If you were dropped off in a 23-square-mile forest full of bears, beasts, and killer cult members, would you know what to do? Where would you go? How about if you had a convenient little marker floating around and pointing you in the direction of the nearest safe house? Video game UI can do just that, and it's especially necessary when today's games are so expansive. Just take a look at this diagram comparing different game maps. UI is the interface that allows a player to navigate the game. It typically includes things like buttons, health and stamina bars, resources, ammo counts, statistics, and anything else you might need to know immediately while you're playing the game. There are 4 main types of UI, so let's get into that. UI can sit inside or outside of the game's narrative, basically whether or not the characters in the game would be aware of its existence. It can also exist inside or outside of the game's physical space. If you turn around, can you see it? Or is it attached to your screen? Non-diegetic UI is UI that exists outside of the game's story and outside of the game's space. The characters in the game wouldn't be interacting with it, it's really only there for the player's benefit. So think classic stats bars in the corner of your screen, points, and stats icons. This type of UI, in most cases, is the most recognizable and easy to understand. Diegetic UI is just the opposite. It exists both in the game's narrative and the game space. This is the most integrated form of UI because it blends into the world around it. Take, for example, Dirt. Engage in the close-up perspective and you can see the speedometer change as you shift and accelerate. Both you and your character can see it, and it physically exists in the world. While diegetic UI's strengths lie in its immersion, it might not be the most effective when present in a fast-paced game. A player needs to be able to quickly and easily check their stats, and diegetic UI is not as abstracted or easily recognizable. The next type of UI, meta UI, is interesting because it does exist in the game's story, but not in the game space. This type of UI is often used to visually translate a physical effect that is happening to your character. When your character gets shot, blood splatters the edges of the screen. When you get cold, frost starts to overcome your vision. When Arthur Morgan takes down one too many whiskeys, your vision starts to wobble.
Last drink.
Yeah, just one more.
Exactly.
These types of UI are really useful for communicating the player's state in an intuitive way. The player doesn't have to worry about decoding symbols or icons on the screen. The fourth and final type of UI is spatial UI. Spatial UI does not exist in the game's story, but it does exist in the game space. The characters in the game don't see it, but you can. As you can probably guess, these are things like waypoints, indicators, speech bubbles, and sometimes text. While this type of UI can break immersion, that's not always a bad thing. In a crowd, spatial UI can let you know who has a task or something to say. Spatial UI can even tell you what button to press. Most importantly, it can show you where to go. So most players are familiar with the map. In any sort of open world or large scale game, you'll be able to hit M on your keyboard and pull up some sort of top-down view of the world. But how have we taken maps for granted? Let's jump back a bit to a time when maps and navigational UI were in a more primitive state. The 80s and the 90s were a foundational time for game development, and we start to see some of the very first examples of maps being used. The 1981 arcade game Defender was a pioneer of the minimap. It had a scrolling map at the top of the screen that showed which enemies were coming from your left and your right. Lots of early examples of the map were clunky and took up more space than they were worth. For example, Zelda 1, 1986 on the NES had a minimap which consisted of a gray box and a dot, and it showed you your relative position but not much else. Most early games at this time didn't incorporate a map of any kind, like Atari Adventure, which despite its layout being a literal maze, provided no player assistance when it came to navigation. Maybe part of the charm was trying to memorize where to go or to sketch out your path on a piece of paper. Sid Meier's Civilization 1, 1991 had a fog of war style minimap with waypoints and indicators. Doom, 1993, one of the first and most influential first-person shooters, did have a map, which you could toggle on and off. It was visually simple and resembled vector graphics, but it got the job done. In the early 2000s, we start to see more fleshed out versions of the minimap. Grand Theft Auto 1 and 2 featured an arrow that pointed you in the direction of the objective, but GTA 3 changed the game with a minimap of Liberty City that showed you your location, waypoints, objectives, and more. GPS-style direction became commonplace. Subsequent open-world games took this version of the minimap and ran with it, and now we see it in the corner of almost every open-world game. Another common form of navigational assistance in games is the compass. Elder Scrolls Skyrim, Doom, and Kingdom Come Deliverance are just a few that come to mind. One of the benefits of having a compass instead of a minimap is immersion. Instead of running through the world staring at a little dot in the corner of your screen, A compass allows you to keep an eye on your direction and the beautiful scenery at the same time. When compasses are used in combat games, it allows the player to call out locations of the enemy. Both the minimap and the compass fall into the category of non-diegetic UI, which sits on your screen as a 2D image and not actually part of the game world. There is another form of spatial UI that you might be familiar with, the waypoint. Far Cry leans into spatial UI heavily. There's an arrow over every enemy's head, information icons over anything that can be read, paw icons over animals that can be hunted, and most importantly, a waypoint for where to find your next objective. Though the maps are expansive, it's impossible to ever get lost when you can just run straight for whatever icon is floating in front of you. World of Warcraft uses spatial UI to let the player know which characters have a mission or a task. Spatial waypoints are probably one of the most effective ways to show a player where they need to go. Though the icons can break immersion, they're easy to read. The minimap and the waypoint have been done to death. They're the good old reliable, they're easy to digest, and they get the information across to the player efficiently. But just for fun, let's look at some creative ways that have used UI to make more seamless navigational assistance. Doom has come a long way since their 93 release, with the 2016 version using a 3D model as their map instead of a top-down 2D map. Fallout's Pip-Boy, which sits on your character's wrist, shows you your location as well as other stats, which is a very creative diegetic menu. Minecraft's player-generated map is another example of diegetic UI. No Man's Sky map is one of my personal favorites. You can fly around an infinite 3D, procedurally generated starfield and choose any planet that you like to visit. Shadow of the Colossus features no map, but allows the player to raise up their sword, and when their sword hits the light in a certain way, it'll converge the sunbeams and point in the direction of the next Colossus. In Ghost of Tsushima, the wind blows in the direction that you need to go. Now, you might notice that some of the more creative uses of diegetic UI are in games that are ambient, exploratory, and they're not constantly action-packed. So when you're choosing whether to use traditional, non-diegetic UI, immersive diegetic UI, or some kind of combination, you have to remember that it's a balancing act. Some games will have better success with a navigational system that takes a step back and allows the player to appreciate the world. Some games will need the UI to be in the player's face, easily accessible, and abstracted, so they can get the information that they need. Hopefully, with the information in this video, you'll have a better understanding of how navigation in games has developed over the years. Personally, I look forward to seeing what new and creative ways game developers will use UI to show us the way to go.